The government's been defeated over Europe in the Commons tonight. MPs rejected plans to cut fishing catches in European waters. The lottery regulator is to keep his job. The Heritage Secretary says he's been unwise, but he's honest. And the Tory MP who's lost a libel case and up to £500,000. Good evening. A Backbench Conservative rebellion over European fishing policy inflicted a damaging defeat on the government in the Commons tonight. The Prime Minister had tabled a motion defending the government's acceptance of lower fish quotas. After a bitter debate, it was defeated by 2 votes, 299 to 297. The government isn't in danger, but it has been humiliated, as our political editor Robin Oakley reports.
The ayes to the right, 297. The noes to the left, 299.
For the Tory government, an agonising year had ended with a narrow but morale-sapping defeat on their fisheries policy. Technically, it means little in policy terms, but the opposition were jubilant. Yet again, the fragility of the government's majority and the Tory party's divisions on anything with a European dimension had been exposed. With feelings running high on the common fisheries policy and incursions by Spanish fishermen, the government knew from the start the danger they faced from a combination of Eurosceptics and MPs with fishing constituencies denying them support. The Scottish Secretary argued that renegotiating the CFP was a Herculean, probably impossible task. He sought to reassure doubting Tories.
There is no Spanish Armada, and that is a measure of our success, Madam Speaker. Not walking away from the CFP, but improving it from within.
Arguing the need for European cooperation to preserve stocks, the Fisheries Minister, who sought to woo the doubters with revived harbour grants, could offer only the hope of reform, not the bold policy sweeps the rebels sought.
I think it would be disingenuous, however, to suggest that we could leave the common fisheries policy. We should concentrate instead on reforming the common fisheries policy in ways that will benefit the industry.
While Labour's spokesman admitted that it wasn't his party's policy either to withdraw from the common fisheries policy, he set about the government's record.
This government have imposed unfair and unworkable regulations on our fishing industry. They failed to effectively represent the industry in Europe. And the real problem that our fishing industry has been facing for many years remain unaddressed by this government.
Tory fears were evident as ministers sought to minimise in advance the importance of tonight's vote. And Labour's belief the government could face defeat was evident when 3 seriously ill MPs, one of them in a neck brace, came to the Commons. The Agriculture Minister quickly set out the government's response, promising ministers had listened to what was said.
The government will give due weight to what has been said this evening. My honourable friend the Minister of State will be representing the United Kingdom at the Fisheries Council beginning on 21st December. He will, as he always does, vigorously represent the interests of the United Kingdom and of UK fishermen.
But opposition parties were swift to crow.
The Conservative government is in disarray and in tatters. And the question now is whether they've got the spirit and the will to govern for another year.
This government is going to be defeated again and again in the days to come, and the sooner we can get rid of it, the better.
Ministers who were saying despairingly tonight that they couldn't legislate to put more fish in the sea now have to go smarting to Brussels this week for the latest fishing quota talks. They're on notice to seek a better deal for Britain. But it's the blow to Tory morale which may have the more enduring political effect. Robin Oakley, BBC News, Westminster.
Despite tonight's vote at Westminster, it's Europe's fisheries ministers meeting in Brussels on Thursday who'll decide by how much to reduce next year's fishing quotas. The arguments about overfishing have gone on since Europe's common fisheries policy was introduced in 1970. And when Spain joined the European Union in 1986, their fleet, one of the largest in the community, was banned from some traditional British fishing grounds. But that agreement has run out, and from January 1996, Spanish fishermen will be allowed greater access to British waters.
Tonight, part of the Brixham fleet was at home for Christmas as news came through the government had lost its crucial fishing vote. The defeat was quickly welcomed.
Fishermen and the British public aren't going to lay down to it, and we are going to just battle on until we get what we want. And that means we have a bigger quota of our own fish.
There was some disappointment. Labour's amendment to renegotiate the common fisheries policy had failed, but fisheries leaders said they would carry on the campaign.
We don't see that we have a future within the fisheries policy as it is at the moment. Whether it's a fundamental review or complete scrapping of it, it needs to be done one way or the other.
40 years ago, the Brixham fleet was surprisingly small. Only in recent years has it become a force in the local economy. That's why they've lobbied the government so successfully. This morning, they hoisted their own flag as MPs prepared to debate the fishing industry. Although today's vote is important, there is another still to come. European fisheries ministers meet this week to decide on the UK's fish quotas. Next year's mackerel catch could be reduced by 54%, the amount of plaice caught in the North Sea by almost half, and in the Irish Sea, the quota for sole by more than a third. Some say these cuts are crucial.
The lack of fish is a basic problem, but the more important thing perhaps is that there are far too many fishing vessels. The catching is much too intense. And the big problem, I think, is to reduce the level of exploitation.
Fishing injects £18 million into the local economy, and the cuts are expected to hit the southwest hard, with job losses and more boats being decommissioned. What today's vote has done is push fishing back up the political agenda, putting further pressure on the government to negotiate the best possible deal. Stephen Cape, BBC News, Brixham.
The lottery regulator, Peter Davis, is to keep his job. The National Heritage Secretary, Virginia Bottomley, said that he'd been unwise but not dishonest after taking free flights from G-Tech, an American company which owns a stake in the lottery operator Camelot.
For the past week, Mr Davis has been toughing it out, strongly defending his decision to take flights in a jet owned by G-Tech, saying it had saved time and taxpayers' money. He'd also spent the weekend at the home of an old friend who was a G-Tech director. Tonight, Mrs Bottomley made it clear she was standing by the lottery regulator, despite claims from Labour that he had shown bad judgment.
I have confidence in Mr Davis. He's introduced a very successful lottery. His approach is rigorous and honest. It was unwise to accept those internal flights in America. It took place several months after the award of the licence to Camelot. And in all that context, I've decided it's right for him to continue.
I am grateful to the Secretary of State for her expression of confidence in me as the regulator of the National Lottery. I look forward to continuing my work of ensuring that the National Lottery is run properly, that the interests of the players are protected, and that the maximum funds are raised for the good causes.
But Labour said the decision would be greeted with incredulity.
I think that Mr Davies' conduct has rendered him unfit for the office. He cannot command the confidence of the public as a regulator of the lottery. He ought to have gone. The Secretary of State has failed in her duty to the public to dismiss him from his job.
Mr Davies faces several high-profile tasks in the next few months. There's an independent investigation into Richard Branson's allegations that he was offered a bribe by the head of G-Tech, Guy Snowdon. Mr Davis must review the lottery finances, including Camelot's higher-than-expected profits, and he must issue a licence for future scratch card games amid claims from rivals that Camelot has been trading unfairly. It remains to be seen whether Mrs Bottomley's confidence in Mr Davis is shared by the majority of MPs and the public. Torrin Douglas, BBC News.
South West Trains has become the first rail service to be privatised. The bus company Stagecoach has been given a 7-year franchise to run trains between London Waterloo and the West Country. Tonight, the government said 2 further deals had been signed. In all, 7 networks are on offer in the first phase of privatisation. Stagecoach begins operating services to the south and west of Waterloo in March. The other 2 agreements signed tonight cover the London Tilbury South End line, which will be run by a management buyout team, and the Great Western, linking South Wales, the South West and Paddington. 4 other networks will follow as soon as the government settles the legal arguments over privatisation.
Stagecoach is Britain's biggest bus operator. Last year it sold 11% of all bus tickets. Its successful bid to run South West Trains, one of the biggest rail operators, had been widely expected. But critics fear it may ultimately try replacing uneconomic trains with buses. They're concerned about the long-term future of the single-track line between Salisbury and Exeter. Stagecoach says socially necessary services will continue, but it admits there'll also be job losses.
The number of jobs will certainly be reduced, there's no question about that. We will have to make reductions in overheads, we'll have to get improved operating productivity. How that will happen depends really on how we manage the company. I believe, however, there will be a significant reduction through natural wastage and through voluntary severance.
Stagecoach has a formidable reputation for fierce competition and has survived over 20 complaints to the Office of Fair Trading about the way it runs buses. The Liberal Democrats called the choice a potential disaster. Labour didn't like it either.
Well, the big worry here is that we've got a bus company that operates lots of coaches in the area of the rail network and obviously has a vested interest in rationalising and getting people out of the trains into the coaches or vice versa, which implies a reduction of service.
I think what they want to do is to get more people back onto the railways. There has been a reduction in employment on the railways anyway in the past 3 or 4 years. The important thing is to run the railways efficiently, safely, and provide a good service to passengers. And that's what I believe Stagecoach will do.
Most passengers don't care whether trains are state-run or privatised. They just want improvements.
Better level of service, competitive fares.
Better, cleaner train.
Hopefully something a bit more efficient, with services more closely in tune to the requirements of the customers.
Today, Stagecoach promised more trains, more passengers and lower running costs. Tomorrow, LTS and Great Western management buyout teams will give identical pledges, just like BR used to do. But the government knows that by the next election, privatisation must be seen to have worked. Christopher Wayne, BBC News.
There's been a second fatal shooting in Belfast in 24 hours. In tonight's incident, a man was shot as he returned home from work in the Lower Ormeau area. Gunmen are believed to have taken over a house in the street before the shooting happened.
The shooting happened on the Lower Ormeau Road, a nationalist area in the south of Belfast. The victim, who's believed to be a married man in his 30s, was hit a number of times in the head and chest and died at the scene. This is the second night in a row that there's been a fatal shooting on the streets of Belfast. Last night, gunmen walked into Delaney's fish and chip shop in the north of the city and shot dead the owner, Francis Collins. Even though Mr. Collins at one time served a sentence as an IRA prisoner, some politicians and security sources today said they believed the IRA had been involved in his murder.
I don't want to be knee-jerking in response to that, but one thing is clear. Sinn Féin was not involved, and Sinn Féin does not condone actions like this.
Tonight, the security forces were again out on the streets, beginning an investigation into another murder in Northern Ireland. Although the precise circumstances of tonight's killing are still unclear, it's a depressing image of a place which is meant to be trying to build a lasting peace. Mark Devonport, BBC News, Belfast.
The Conservative MP David Ashby has lost his libel action against the Sunday Times. Mr. Ashby said that the newspaper had wrongly claimed that he was having a homosexual affair and that it had branded him a liar and a hypocrite. He now faces legal bills which could run to hundreds of thousands of pounds.
David Ashby looked grim as he left the High Court this afternoon. There was nothing he wanted to say to the reporters who were swarming round him. Moments earlier, he'd sat in court with his head in his hands, apparently crying as the jury's verdict began to sink in. Mr. Ashby's estranged wife had tried to comfort him before she left court, but he simply brushed her away. Mrs. Ashby said it gave her no pleasure to see her husband lose an expensive libel action.
I hope that it will not have a terrible effect on him. On numerous occasions, I asked him to think twice before continuing with the litigation, which I did not believe would be in anybody's long-term interest.
The Sunday Times and its former editor had persuaded the jury that the story it published 2 years ago was substantially true. The paper said in effect that Mr. Ashby had had a homosexual affair, that he'd lied to the public when he denied it, and that he'd been a hypocrite when he presented himself as an upholder of family values. Mr. Ashby had admitted sharing a bed with Kieran Kilduff, a 32-year-old doctor, during a weekend holiday in France, but he denied any homosexual behaviour. When the foreman of the jury returned with their verdict, the mood in court was one of sympathy rather than surprise. Here was a man who'd been suffering from emotional problems, who'd been suffering from depression, and who'd taken on the huge risks of a libel action against a major newspaper. Mr. Ashby had hoped for vindication. In the end, all he had was a legal bill running into hundreds of thousands of pounds.
Ashby.
The mood of sympathy was evident in the Commons this afternoon.
Madam Speaker, may I thank the House?
Mr. Ashby also learnt that the Sunday Times might not be demanding its full legal costs from him. But in his Leicestershire constituency, Conservative Party officials said they wanted to speak to their MP before deciding who should represent the party at the next general election. Joshua Rosenberg, BBC News.
16 extra prison officers have been drafted into Holloway Prison after the Chief Inspector of Prison said standards at the North London Women's Jail were unacceptably low. Yesterday, an inspection at Holloway was halted when the prison was found to be running a heavy-handed security regime, and the prison management were ordered to make immediate improvements. A government inquiry into the running of Whitemoor prison following the escape of 5 IRA prisoners last year has said that staff have made outstanding progress on tightening up security. An earlier report by Sir John Learmont had been highly critical of the prison, calling it a disaster waiting to happen. British Nuclear Fuels is to create up to 1,000 jobs at a new nuclear waste treatment plant at Sellafield in Cumbria. Building work on the £360 million plant will begin in 1997 and will start operating 5 years later. The Chancellor's forecast for growth in the British economy next year has been questioned by a leading group of international economists. The Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, said the UK's gross domestic product would expand by less than 2.5% in 1996. That's well below the Treasury's target of 3% growth.
The engineering sector has seen recovery faltering in the dying weeks of the year in common with the rest of British industry. But the Engineering Employers Federation confidently predicts better things in 1996. According to the OECD, that optimism may be misplaced. From its palatial Paris headquarters comes the forecast that growth in the UK will slow next year to 2.4%, with the rapid economic rebound predicted by the government failing to materialise.
The government thinks that that process will be rather short-lived. We think that there'll perhaps be another quarter or two of rather weak growth before the economy resumes its growth path.
Kenneth Clark's Budget Day forecast of 3% growth next year will have been proved badly off target if the OECD forecast is right.
With this report confirming that the economy is far weaker than the government forecast and becoming weaker by the month, even as we enter Christmas, the Chancellor should be ashamed of himself that his budget has done nothing to rectify the situation.
Nonetheless, the UK's record in job creation is praised in the international study. In Japan, unemployment is rising to 3.4%, although it's still way below European levels. In the United States, the jobless total will climb to 5.7%, around half Europe's average. But within Europe, the UK comes out well, with unemployment falling to 8.2%, compared with 11.3% in France and more than 21% in Spain.
Our growth rate is said to be equivalent to Germany, with inflation as they measured it within 0.5% of Germany, and with unemployment lower than Germany. That's a good success story. It's one we should be proud of as a country.
Tomorrow, latest news from Britain's housing market will confirm a sorry tale of falling prices and turnover in 1995. Mortgage lenders base their confidence for an upturn next year on hopes of lower interest rates. The OECD does not take any such easing in rates for granted. Peter Morgan, BBC News.
The trial of the man who confessed to murdering the Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin has begun in Tel Aviv. Yigal Amir, who's charged with premeditated murder, wasn't asked to enter a plea. His trial's been adjourned for a month to give the defence more time to prepare his case. The British officer, Lieutenant General Sir Michael Walker, who'll command the 60,000 NATO troops in Bosnia, has arrived in Sarajevo. From tomorrow, NATO takes over peacekeeping duties from the United Nations.
A real Sarajevo snowstorm greeted General Walker as he touched down for a 12-month tour of duty. He's the first man to command a NATO land operation, but his opening comments were for the Bosnian people. He promised them that NATO would be even-handed and that NATO had come here to start a peace and not a war.
We are here to implement a peace agreement which has been given the consent of the parties here at the very highest level. And we've come to help them implement their agreement.
As NATO arrives, the UN is moving out. After nearly 4 years, this is UNPROFOR's last day in existence and the last of 1,000 press conferences.
No longer you will have to listen to our excuses for UN inaction or see our brightened up faces when we, the United Nations, did act decisively. We have lived with you through some horrific times, but we have also seen peace come to Bosnia.
The Bosnian government's verdict on the UN performance here is somewhat harsher.
The UN policy here was flawed from the very beginning. They came here to be neutral. They came here to play the role of the Red Cross. The UN has pursued here the policy of containment.
NATO generals have been holding their first meetings with local commanders. The warring parties are trying to size up exactly what kind of army they've got in their country. But they already know that it's going to be a very different force from the UN. Tom Carver, BBC News, Sarajevo.
The Russian Prime Minister Viktor Chernomyrdin has ruled out major changes in government policy despite the Communist Party's success in the country's parliamentary elections. The Communist Party leader Gennady Zyuganov has called on the government to resign after his party won more than 20% of the vote. The time limit for storing frozen human embryos, which are used in test tube baby treatment, is to be extended to 10 years. At the moment, frozen embryos can only be kept for 5 years, and the first group of embryos was due to be destroyed next summer.
In this vat of liquid nitrogen are scores of human embryos, deep frozen and in suspended animation. Some have been here for years. Under the old regulations, after 5 years in storage, they would have had to be used or allowed to die. Clinics were faced with the prospect next summer of destroying many hundreds of embryos, and many didn't like it.
It would be something which would go beyond our responsibility. And the patients eventually they had to make the final decision, and probably we would have to contact legal firms to find out where we stand legally from the point of view of destroying life which belongs to a third party.
Now, after protests from clinics and patients, it's proposed the regulations should change so that embryos can be stored for up to 10 years and longer if it's justified on medical or social grounds. Thousands of infertile couples have had their lives transformed by test tube baby treatment. By using frozen embryos, they can have several tries after just one procedure for recovering eggs. The new regulations could eventually affect many couples whose frozen embryos have been stored for years.
The scheme we have devised will be one whereby couples will have to come and discuss the matter with the clinic and receive counselling if they require it, so they will be able to think through all the consequences. The embryo need not be destroyed. It might be donated to another couple or used for research.
There are some 30,000 frozen embryos stored in clinics throughout the country, and the number is increasing all the time. If Parliament approves the new regulations, it will allow thousands of couples a breathing space to decide what to do. James Wilkinson, BBC News.
Scottish football supporters who've been allocated just 7,000 tickets for the European Championship match against England next summer have been told they won't get any more. The competition organisers said Scotland would receive the same number as any other visiting nation for the finals.
Scottish football fans gathering at tonight's Motherwell Rangers clash have been denied their annual fixture against the old enemy England for the past 7 years. So the encounter in the European Championships next summer has added spice. But the Scots will only get 7,000 tickets for Wembley Stadium, and they're not happy about it.
It's a disgrace. I mean, the likes of the crowd that we can carry, you know, you're talking about 30,000 at least.
I think we should get a lot more tickets than 7,000, because there'll be a lot more than 7,000 want to go to the game in the first place.
But Scotland is being treated like all the other national sides. No preferential treatment, no extra tickets.
There's no special pleading available for Scotland. They are one of 16 teams, and we just have to take that into account.
The regular meeting between England and Scotland was part of the sporting calendar. After a succession of appalling scenes of crowd violence, it was ended in 1989. Scottish fans do not have the dreadful reputation of some English supporters. They won the Fair Play Award at the last European Championships 3 years ago. But the prospect of an estimated 15,000 Scots descending on Wembley looking for tickets on the black market is a worry for police.
Some teams will be more of a challenge in policing terms. I like to think times have moved on,
that our intelligence is much sharper and more focused than it has been in the past.
Security measures for Euro 96 have been planned for months. It's feared the England-Scotland game on June the 15th may pose their most rigorous early test. Adam Minot, BBC News.
Now back to tonight's main story, the government's defeat in the Commons in a vote on European fish quotas. Joining me from Westminster is our political editor, Robin Oakley. Robin, obviously a blow for the government, even a humiliating one, but does it actually change anything?
Well, it's certainly not going to change the common fisheries policy. There was no legislation at stake here. It was only what's called a take-note motion. And the question of changing anything about the common fisheries policy would have to be agreed by 14 other European nations. That's simply not going to happen. I think what we will see is Tories now trying to push the government into getting the fisheries policy onto the agenda for the Intergovernmental Conference, which will update Maastricht next year. But I don't think they're going to succeed in that either.
So what do you see as the wider significance of this defeat tonight?
Well, essentially, it's a demonstration of the fragility of the government's position. It's got a small majority already, another by-election looming. It shows just how much trouble there is going to be ahead for Mr Major trying to get through to April 1997 and keep his legislative programme intact.
Robin, thanks very much indeed. Newsnight is on BBC Two at 10:30, but that's the 9 o'clock news tonight. Good night.